Howdy folks, it's me, and it's finally time for me to make a full video about the best X-Men cartoon, X-Men Evolution. For those of you who don't know, it's a cartoon from the early 2000s whose main gimmick was that most of the X-Men were teenagers despite being adults in the source material. They also all went to public school, which is kind of weird, but we'll get to that later. If you have been on my channel for any amount of time, then you probably know that I really love this show and consider it to be the best adaptation of the X-Men, although I've only briefly gone over why. Today we're going to talk about the show as a whole, about all the things it did right, and also all the things it did wrong. And I wore my Wolverine jacket for it, as you can see. If you are a die-hard comics purist, then you probably won't like this show due to the things that it changes. But if you're willing to take the show at more than face value and appreciate the way that it tries to be different, you might really like it. It's not for everyone, and I can totally understand why someone wouldn't like it, but in my opinion it perfectly displays what an adaptation is supposed to be. Not a carbon copy, but something that takes the source material and uses it in an interesting way. Now don't go into the show expecting fantastic writing or anything like that. It is a cartoon made for kids, and that's something that you just have to accept. However, when you do, and you just appreciate it for what it is, it's just flat out a fun watch.
Within the show, we have the usual X-Men things. Professor X organizes a team of mutant teenagers that teaches them to control their powers and use them to fight evil. The only other adults are Storm and Wolverine, as well as Beast, who joins the cast in Season 2. The main cast of teenagers are Cyclops, Jean Grey, Nightcrawler, Shadowcat, Rogue, and Spike, and we see some other more B-list characters join the show along the way, but very few of them are given real focus or character development, so I probably won't talk about them too much. As I said before, even though the X-Men live at the X-Mansion, they go to public school. So yeah, that's weird. However, I choose to accept that aspect since the show is still good overall. It allows for some interesting interactions and keeps the X-Men from being too isolated, so it at least serves the story even if it doesn't make much logical sense.
I could go over the seasons and episodes, but since this is essentially a contrast to my other video about why the movies are a bad adaptation, I'm going to use a similar format for this one. Since the characters were what made the movies a bad adaptation, let's talk about how they made this show a good one.
To begin, let's talk about Professor Charles Xavier. It's clear that the show drew some inspiration from the films, and Charles's character is one of the areas where that's evident. Similarly to the movies, he's pretty similar to the comics, but less strict and a little more gentle and fatherly. He isn't actually featured that strongly over the course of the show. He is definitely present throughout the whole thing, but he doesn't really get any development. It's probably because he's supposed to be the wise father figure role model, and not someone who's supposed to learn lessons or anything like that. Overall, not too much to say other than that he's likable and, I think, a good iteration of the character for what he is. Next up is Scott Summers, aka Cyclops, and in a very refreshing turn of events, he is not at all sidelined within this adaptation. He could be considered pretty different from his comic book counterpart since he is far less serious and socially awkward, and far more inclined to make jokes and, actually smile. It probably comes down to personal preference on how much that bothers you, but overall I think he retains most of the important elements of Cyclops. He's still the straight-laced, rule-following leader, but he has an extra dose of charisma that makes his character more palatable. He doesn't have the same amount of angst and sadness as his comic backstory, probably because it's a kid's show, but they still keep most of it and you can see how it affects his character. And what's most important, and a point that you'll hear me reiterating multiple times over the course of this video, he is an actual character. No, he's not lifted right off the page, but we still see his personality, his relationships, and his growth over the course of the series, unlike most adaptations which give him absolutely nothing. Then there's Scott's ladylove, Jean Grey, and let's start off by saying that this show has the best adaptation of her, hands down. Now that there was an immense amount of competition, considering that in the 90s series she was just a complete wimp, and in Wolverine and the X-Men she's barely in the show at all, and I already talked about how she was wasted in the movies. Regardless, that doesn't mean that Evolution Jean Grey simply wins the title of Best Adaptation by default. Her character has a lot to offer, and she has all of those things I mentioned her movie counterpart lacking. Acting like a big sister to the other X-Men, having her temper, and they really showcase her potential as an extremely powerful character. Not to mention, I love how they develop her and Scott's relationship. First of all, since it's given actual development rather than just they're together because they're together or whatever, and also because it's just so gosh darn sweet.
I'd also like to add that I heard that if they had gotten a 5th season, then they would have adapted the Phoenix Saga, and can I just say I am so sad that they didn't get to do that. Like seriously, just imagine that storyline with this Jean Grey and tell me that it would not be the best adaptation of it ever. Like seriously, if they had done it and if Jean had actually died at the end, that would have been devastating. but like in a good way. But unfortunately, it shall never be.
Now let's talk about Nightcrawler, otherwise known as the best character on the show. They get so much right with his character. He's the same mischievous imp we know and love, while also being a complete sweetheart. I also really love that they explore his relationship with Rogue and them both being children of Mystique, since I've very rarely seen that anywhere else, and it's just so sweet. I've seen some people criticize Nightcrawler as being too immature, which I can see to some extent, but it was never really a problem for me. He is a teenage boy, so it does kind of make sense for the setting. Actually, the one complaint that I have about Kurt's character is that they never so much as mention or reference his Catholicism. I wouldn't have wanted them to shoehorn it in, but surely there was some way they could do it. I mean, they show Kitty lighting a menorah with her family, and Kitty's not nearly as devout a Jew as Kurt is a Catholic, so it's just like, why do you show the Jewish character and not the Catholic one, huh?
I have nothing against Jews, by the way, and I don't mind at all that they decided to show that aspect of Kitty's character. I just wish they had done it for Kurt as well. But the bottom line is that Kurt is great in this show, and since I brought up Kitty, let's talk about her.
Here are where things start to drift into a little more negative territory. Now don't get me wrong, I don't dislike Kitty in this show at all, but I do find their casting choice interesting. Like seriously, no hate against the actress, but her voice can be a little obnoxious, especially in those first episodes. It definitely gets better as time goes on, but at first it's just kind of like, what? Now setting her voice aside and simply looking at the character, I do like Kitty, even though she's different from her comic book counterpart in some ways. She's a lot more like a typical girly teenager, while I feel like comic Kitty was always very much a tomboy, and while they do sort of reference her technological genius aspect, it's more of an Easter egg for the eagle-eyed than anything else. I think overall my biggest complaint is that Kitty just isn't that interesting of a character by herself. My favorite moments with her are the ones where she's interacting with other characters, stuff like her friendship with Kurt or her father-daughter-like relationship with Logan. It's not a bad thing, but it does kind of stick out, since it's kind of my whole thing with this video to point out how well the show handled the characters even as it changed them, and Kitty could be considered a lot more shallow in comparison to the other characters. In the end, I still like Evolution Shadowcat a lot, and she isn't a bad character by any means. In fact, she probably is also the best adaptation of this character so far, considering how little she gets in the other stuff that she's in. But that being said, she does showcase the somewhat weaker elements of the show, and isn't the best example when pointing out all of the things it does right. Moving on, let's talk about Kitty's roommate and resident X-Man with the most depressing power, Rogue. Now, if we're going to talk about characters that the show changed the most, Rogue would definitely be at the top of the list. Because in the comics, Rogue is a very bright individual, cheerful, confident, full of that southern sass, and those are all very likable elements of her character. But here in Evolution, you see Rogue, and it turns out she's a dark goth, all reclusive and shy and grumpy, but she still has a southern sass, so clearly they understood what was most important about her character. In all seriousness, though, you look at Evolution Rogue, and your first thought, you're just kind of like, why? Why would they make such drastic changes to her look and her character and everything? Well, as it turns out, it makes a lot more sense once you think about it.
Going back to the main point of this video, which is essentially adaptations can change things as long as they do something interesting, that is what happens here with Rogue. I don't have this on authority, obviously, but I think what the writers did is they looked at Rogue's character and decided to experiment, to explore how her character could have been different given her background. When you literally drain the life out of every person that you touch, it's honestly not that surprising that you would be kind of depressed and cranky all the time. So rather than making Rogue different for no reason at all, they took the character in a logical direction, and while I'm glad that it didn't become the norm for everything that she's in going forward, I think it provides a very interesting character for the time that we have her in this show. And I've also seen a lot of positive responses to this version of her, where people actually found her to be more relatable and interesting than her comic book self. That is debatable, of course, but it goes to show that there is an audience for this sort of thing.
Another thing that I appreciate is that even as they made Rogue more grumpy and not so friendly, they still retain the kind-hearted aspect of her character. No, you wouldn't think she's kind-hearted going off of an initial impression, but you can see by how she acts that she cares very deeply for the other X-Men and is always willing to protect them. The best example, in my opinion, is in the episode Power Surge, where Jean's powers have become too much for her and she can't control them, kinda like foreshadowing to that Phoenix Saga we never got. Rogue freely volunteers, with absolutely no prompting, to go in the hurricane of flying debris and siphon off some of Jean's power so that she won't be so overwhelmed. Keep in mind that Rogue spent the entire episode up until this point resenting Jean and being jealous of her, but when it comes down to the wire, she steps up to help her out. So yeah, even though it's a little weird, I like what they do with Rogue in this show. I think the only complaint I would have is that they never give her a real name, despite the fact that in this context it's really awkward not to do so. Like, I get that everyone calls her Rogue, that's fine, but you couldn't just show that she has another name? Destiny has been raising her for something like 12 or 13 years. Don't you think she would call her by some name? Not to mention the fact that she is attending a freaking public school where she would definitely have to be registered under some name. I wouldn't be complaining about this if it weren't for all that, and because in those early episodes where she's introduced, it really feels like they're explicitly avoiding giving her a name for absolutely no reason. And you can't say that they did it because she didn't have an established name in the comics, because we already know that the show has no problem diverging from the source material, and they straight up changed the names of Avalanche and Toad from what they were in the comics, so it's just like, you can't come up with anything? Really?
I really need to stop going into overly long rants about Rogue. Let's move on.
The final regular X-Teen is Evan Daniels, aka Spike, and if you've never seen the show then you probably have no idea who I'm talking about, because he was created for this show and never got used by anyone ever again. And honestly, I can kinda see why. Not to say that he's an awful character or anything, but when compared to the rest of the cast, even Shadowcat, he really kinda falls flat. He's just kinda like this skateboarding punk who doesn't really have any interesting character development, or even interesting relationships like how Kitty does. He's made to be Storm's nephew, which is fine, I guess, but outside of her, he doesn't really have any meaningful interactions with the rest of the cast. They did make an attempt to revamp his character by having him join the Morlocks and be like a vigilante, which is interesting enough, I suppose, but even then he just never really grabbed me like the other X-Men did. It also cracks me up that, like, he's talking to Storm, and he's all like, I'm different now, Auntie, I have to go live with the people who understand me, and Storm's like, no, wait, but he just goes off to live in the sewers anyway, and it's just like, what did she tell his parents? Yeah, sorry that son of yours that you entrusted to my keeping is now living in the sewers and eating trash. Sorry about that. Like I said, the show isn't perfect. Going back to speaking seriously about Evan's character, I think it also doesn't help that sometimes he feels really forced. The show doesn't shove him down our throats or anything like that, but it mainly comes to light in the fact that he's kind of underpowered when compared to everybody else. Like, we've got super destructive eye beams, telekinesis and telepathy, teleportation, intangibility, literally sucking the life out of people, not to mention weather manipulation, adamantium claws, and super enhanced agility and strength, and then there's just this dude who can shoot spikes. So there will be situations where he'll do something that any of the other X-Men could have done in a much better and more efficient way probably. It's just like the writers are going, see? We told you he was useful.
So yeah, I don't hate Spike as a character, and I probably wouldn't even bring him up if I were talking about the supposedly bad aspects of the show, but I think the reason for that is that he's just kind of forgettable, and in a show with so many other strong characters, that's really a shame.
But now let's talk about his Auntie-O, our favorite Weather Witch Aurora, also known as Storm. Super creative codenames run in her family, clearly. Now there's not a whole lot I can say here, unfortunately, because this show is a part of the running trend where Storm doesn't get to do anything. She gets a grand total of 1 episode to herself, and even then, she spends half of it trapped in a box while the other X-Men have to rescue her. Like, points for showing her claustrophobia, I guess, but come on, give Storm something, gosh darn it. This show might be where I am the most upset about it, because the little tidbits we do get of Storm are really great. She has that regal, refined feeling, but she's also down to earth and caring to the kids. It would have been so good, but no. So I guess all I can say about Storm is that I wish there was more. Now on to the most famous mutant of them all, Wolverine, who you'll notice has not been mentioned very much in this video. That's because, unlike every other adaptation, Wolverine is not the most important one just because he's Wolverine. He still gets much more than Storm, not that I'm upset about that or anything, no. But it is way more evenly distributed than either of the other shows, and certainly more than the movies. In regards to his character, however, I like it quite a bit. He's pretty much the same Wolverine you'll see anywhere, except a little bit less violent and a little bit more responsible, since he's supposed to be more of a teacher and role model for the kids, and not just the resident bad boy. And I am 100% okay with that, because wise old Uncle Wolverine is my favorite Wolverine. His relationships with Kitty and Rogue are adorable, and I like that we don't have to go over the whole Jean love triangle thing again, because in this context it would just be wrong. And it means I can fully ship him with Storm, and no one can stop me. So yeah, I don't have a whole lot of bad things to say about Logan at all. His voice is a little bit different than most others who play him, but there isn't anything wrong with it, and it definitely grows in you as the show progresses. Really, my only criticism is that he doesn't have his sideburns. I mean, come on. Wolverine, and he doesn't have sideburns? What the heck are you doing? Clearly my priorities are perfectly aligned. I'm more sad about Logan's sideburns and Rogue's name than anything else. The last of the main characters is Hank McCoy, aka Beast, who, as I've mentioned before, is my favorite X-Man of all time. Unfortunately, however, he is not my favorite in this show, or my second favorite, for that matter. There isn't anything wrong with him, and honestly I can't really pinpoint a reason why I don't like this incarnation of Beast as well as I like others, since he's mostly the same as his comic book self. His voice may have something to do with it, the actor is completely fine, but his voice just doesn't quite sound like Beast to me. I don't know, maybe it's because he doesn't quote poetry enough. Really though, I think that overall he just doesn't have the same charisma that most other adaptations of Beast have. Similar to Spike, he falls more in the forgettable category, but doesn't detract from the overall quality of the show as a whole. Now, in addition to the other X-Men, there are other mutant students at the X-Mansion, and even though they're never referred to in the show as the New Mutants, 5 out of 9 of them have been members of the New Mutants, so that's what we call them. And I don't have too much to say about them, since they never really get any development outside of being the comic relief, and the little slivers of character that they do have seem similar enough to their comic book counterparts. Iceman probably gets the most, and I really like what they do with him. Honestly, I wish they had just made him a part of the main cast rather than Spike, but oh well. Other than that, all I can say is Boom Boom is fine, Jamie is adorable, and points for making Magma nicer and not just someone who whines constantly, I guess.
Now that I've gone over all the characters individually and what makes them good and bad, I'm going to try and wrap things up here by talking about their interactions with each other and how that makes the show so good. And that's really just it. The interactions between the X-Men and their relationships are really the heart of the show and the best part about it. They really feel like one big chaotic family where Professor X is the dad, Storm's kind of like the mom, you have Beast who's the chill uncle, and Wolverine who's the scary uncle, Scott's the responsible big brother, Jean is the cool older sister, and Rogue and Evan are the problem rebel children, and Kitty and Kurt are the youngest who are always getting into trouble. The dynamic is just so fun and it feels so real with how they care about each other and stick up for each other, and also when they have their disagreements and fall out with each other. Because that's what the X-Men are all about. Societal outcasts coming together and finding a family who loves them for who they are, while also saving the world along the way. So to conclude, X-Men Evolution is a very special show. It's not perfect, certainly, but it nails the family dynamic of the X-Men so well that I feel like it has to be considered the best adaptation. You are entirely free to disagree, of course, but that's just how I feel about it. There are definitely less than stellar episodes and a lot of moments that make you go, oh yeah, this is a cartoon made for kids in the early 2000s. That doesn't stop from having awesome characters, cool music, and some dope action scenes. So if you like the X-Men and you've never seen this show, definitely give it a try. Alright, that was fun. Thank you for joining me in this discussion about one of my favorite shows, and I hope you enjoyed. This will probably be the last X-Men content I make for a little while, but there will be more to come, I promise. For now, I've got a few other ideas and projects that I'm going to be working on and introducing here pretty soon, so keep an eye out for that, if you care. Sorry for the decrease in lighting quality. It's raining outside, and you might have heard, if you heard any rain, I'm sorry about that. But hopefully it still all turned out okay. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time.